Hello and welcome to Pastor's Perspective, sponsored by Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa. My name is Brian Perez, and it is Monday, the 20-something of, no, it's not 20-something yet. Tomorrow's 20-something. Yes. 19, December 19th, 2022. We are live today. Yes, we're not normally live on Mondays, but we have been for the past few weeks. Today is probably going to be our last live Monday in a long time, at least for the rest of the year, because we're not going to be here next Monday for sure. The Thursday programs that we record on the second hour between 4 and 5 that you're used to hearing on Mondays, well, we've saved all those, and we're going to be playing those during the holiday break. So the next week or 2 weeks of Pastor's Perspective will be all brand new programs for you, maybe with the exception of one, but you can tune in and you'll hear new programming that you had not yet heard unless you were watching on Facebook, YouTube, or TikTok when we were doing the program live. So thank you so much for joining us today. We are here till 4 p.m. and we'd love to hear from you at 888-564-6173. That's 888-564-6173. And answering your questions today, we've got the great Dr. Bobby Conway, the pastor of Image Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. He's also the guy you see on the 1 Minute Apologist channel on YouTube. And here in the studio, sitting in for Brian Broderson one more time, it's Richard Cimino, one of the assistant pastors at Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa, where Brian is senior pastor. What's up, guys?
Great to be here.
Greetings.
Glad to have you guys here.
Yeah, happy Monday before Christmas.
Yes, can you believe it? We have made it. Well, not quite. Almost. But we're closer today than we were yesterday. All right, so give us a call. 888-564-6173 is the number to reach us today. We're going to start with a question sent in on Facebook, and we'll try to get to your call. We will get to your calls in just a little bit, but let's do at least one of these from Facebook. Here's one from Mike. I have a question about the gift of tongues. 1 Corinthians 14 says, "One who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men, but to God, for no one understands, but in his spirit he speaks mysteries." Over in Acts 2, it says, "They all began to speak with other tongues. The crowd came together, and they were bewildered because each one of them was hearing them speak in his own language, saying, 'We hear them in our own tongues, speaking the mighty deeds of God.'" Mike says, "I looked up the Greek word for tongues, and it's the same in each occasion. Can you help me understand this potential discrepancy between how Paul describes tongues as not understandable, but Acts says they understood?" Richard, what do you say?
Well, I think the miracle of the day of Pentecost was that what was transpiring is these people from all these different ethnic backgrounds, they were hearing in their own language. In other words, God was giving these men the ability to speak his praises in languages that would be understandable to those people. I think the context, as Paul's describing these gifts in Corinthians, has to do with the fact that somebody's going to be giving an utterance that's not known to them. And that's, I know that there are people who have actually given testimony to the fact that they were given an utterance in tongues someplace out of the country, and somebody came up to them and said, "You are speaking in perfect dialect. And it is interesting. If I'm not mistaken, in the passage in the book of Acts, and Bobby, you might help me here, they heard them in their dialects, not just in their language, but in like the Bronx, or uptown Manhattan or East London. They were hearing in the dialect, not
or Southern
their
drawl.
language. So I hope that helps a little bit. Bobby, anything you want to throw in there?
No, that's good, bud. I appreciate those thoughts. It's all a bit, it's a bit cryptic to the guy who can't speak in tongues. So I take it on what I see in the Word and just kind of leverage those interpretations. But it's amazing that, it's an amazing story. But there's a lot going on there in Acts chapter 2. I mean, that's for sure. Just standing out at that scene, just tongues of fire. Like my brain kind of goes, okay, like were there like actual tongues of fire flying around in the air, or like, or is this just kind of like the power of God? So, there's a place where it's like I find myself, looking at scenes like that sometimes and going, man, how do we understand this? Because if you walked outside, and said like, hey, it's raining cats and dogs, nobody would think it's raining literal cats and dogs.
Right.
But sometimes what happens is when we go to the interpretation of the Bible, we get far removed. And I think there would be some interpreters that if they read, oh yeah, and it was raining cats and dogs. I think that people, oh yeah, well, this was Bible times. It was raining cats and dogs. And I'm just not, sure how to always put that together. But I don't think it ever rained cats and dogs.
Mike, even during the flood?
Yeah, no, I don't. I think
Mike, thanks for sending.
It drowned cats and dogs in the flood, but it did not rain cats and dogs.
That's right. Mike, thank you for sending in your question on Facebook Messenger on the Pastor's Perspective Facebook page. Did you have another thought, Richard?
No.
Okay, making sure. Okay, here's, well, you know what? Let's go to the phones. Maybe we'll do another Facebook question afterwards. But Candace in California, welcome to Pastor's Perspective. Hello.
Hi, guys. How you guys doing?
Doing well, thanks. How are you?
Awesome.
Good,
Pretty good. I'm in home for the holidays. I actually live in Hawaii now, but visiting people in California, getting some of that cold weather.
Wow. Well, thank you for thinking of turning on the radio today.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, do you have the K-Wave app on your phone for when you go back to Hawaii?
Not yet. I actually listen to you guys on Spotify right now, but I could definitely look into that for sure.
Cool. Awesome. All right. So how can we help you today?
Yeah, so over the past 3 years, I met this gentleman in my Bible study group, and wasn't really in a place to date, but I, infatuated with him a little bit, prayed about it. The next year, like, signs and stuff started happening, but I'm like, okay, like, Lord, if this isn't you, make it stop, because, I'm still trying to heal from other things. And he told me that he was moving to Virginia. So I was like, okay, well, that's a closed door. And that day I had a conference I went to, so I was driving up my hill back home, and I was praying to the Lord and singing, like, if you said it, we believe it, if he's meant to be, whatever. And he called me, and he said, what were you singing? I was actually walking the hill, and I saw your car go by, and you were singing at the top of your lungs. I was like, that's weird. Okay. And, still didn't tell him anything, because still praying through it. And this year, he had since then moved to Virginia. I went to a wedding, and as I'm driving up, I felt that spirit of, like, he's going to be there. And I'm like, no, he lives in Virginia now. He's not coming. Lord, like, if this is the closed door, it's a closed door. And when he's not there, I will completely, like, let it go into your hands. No more thinking about him. Mm-hmm. And he was the first person I saw when I drove up. Everybody else had already gone up to the wedding portion of it, and we were in the parking lot. And I was like, okay, Lord. So I finally prayed on it, asked some counseling, and I told him how I felt. And I said, have you been getting anything like that? And he's like, no, I haven't. And he's like, I've had that happen too, where I felt these signs, and, I asked the person and they didn't feel the same way. Mm-hmm. So my question is, like, what is that? Like, especially if we're praying against it and all these signs just keep happening, like, it felt like it was God, but if it's not, then, have you experienced that before? Or heard of people having that happen before?
Wow. Bobby, what would you say to Candace?
I think one way that we can get confused with God, Candace, is through circumstances. It's difficult to know when circumstances are mundane or ultra mundane, when circumstances are, just kind of ordinary, that we're not meant to read anything in particular into it, versus when there's something providential going on. Now, some people would want to say, God's just a part of every day, so every day is just a mirror. Well, that's true. God creates our everyday and he's in charge of it all, but it's not like he's providentially grabbing our attention in a powerful, transformative way every moment that we're awake. Those are key defining moments. And I would say it can be very confusing for us as Christians when we interpret a circumstance in our life as God, and then it doesn't seem like that's the way it turns out. So I would say there are several of those examples in my own life where I've had a lot of confirming circumstances where it was amazing, like God was at work and it proved to be true. But there are plenty of other examples where I thought, maybe because another Christian told me this is what God's doing, or this is going to happen. And maybe at times, if I'm being honest with myself, early on as a Christian, probably in the first 3 to 4 years, I think I was sign hunting because I didn't know my Bible. And so I was just looking for God to speak, give me a sign. I mean, I would be opening up fortune cookies, for crying out loud, and, looking for signs. And so I think there can be a danger where we look so much for it that we want it to be true. But here's what I would say. We aren't to be disillusioned by God with it, though it can be confusing. If anything, perhaps it's God's way of just, reminding us that his ways are mysterious, or it could be that it's God's way of showing us that we're not to get too dependent upon looking at circumstances, but more dependent on looking at his word. At other times, it could be that God wants to test us to see, are we able to just trust him even when it looks like something's going in a particular direction and then it turns out that it doesn't? Do we allow that disillusionment, that crisis of faith, so to speak, cause us to write God off? So there are a number of reasons that I've had to come up with, even in my own head, to deal with some of how jaded I felt after being disillusioned. But I have to give God the benefit of the doubt and go, okay, maybe I was putting something on God. Like isn't it interesting how much, if you go sit down with another Christian and ask the Christian to tell you his story, he'll lay out a story of God's providential work in his life. It'll sound like a history book. Well, God led me here, and then God did this, and then God did that, and then this ended up happening, God did this. And I'm not always convinced that our providential stories is spot on as much as we'd like to think. I think that we catch some of it, but I think that all of us are broken interpreters of what God's up to. So what do you make of this? I would say, this is going to be between you and the Lord, because this is experiential. It's circumstantial stuff. And you're going to have to just try to interpret that through what the Lord is up to in your life. I'd say the application would be, don't get disillusioned with God. I'll tell you, when I was a young Christian, everywhere I was going to preach throughout Arkansas, I would go preach in these churches, and people would say, "Oh man, you're going to be the next Billy Graham." I was a fiery preacher, man, when I was younger. And so I was ignorant and stupid. I didn't know anything about the Bible. I was just passionate. Well, I had been told that God speaks through people. So I thought, oh, okay, well, if God speaks through people, this must be the case. So, lo and behold, every preacher just about was told that by somebody in their life. And we all had to get disillusioned thinking that God had something for us, right? So all that to say, I think walking with God would be a lot less confusion if we wouldn't try to act like it's so not confusing. Like, I think it would be easier to deal with some of this disillusionment If in the church we would talk about, sometimes it's so difficult, isn't it, just to really figure out what God's up to. But instead we want to all come off like we've just got God figured out in his clear direction. And frankly, that's not always the way it rolls.
Yeah. And I think that, first of all, take heart. You're not alone in wondering why it seems that you're seeing things one way and somebody else doesn't see them. I don't want to say that it's absolutely couldn't be the Lord. It could be the Lord doing these things, but his time is not your time. What he's doing in this guy's life is not.
That's right.
In time, in step with you. Mm-hmm. I just want to be very, very careful. The bottom line is if it's really the Lord, God's going to get it done. Mm-hmm. And if it isn't, there's a lot of people who. And I'm not saying this is you, because this is something very subjective. It's very personal to you, and you're trying to understand these things. But there are a lot of people who tag the Lord's name on things, and as though this is the Lord that's doing it, and so count on it; it's going to happen. And they may be great people, they may be Jesus people, Bible-loving people, and they love you, and they really believe, they feel this is what God has said to them, but it's not always the reality that God said something to them, or that they were hearing the Lord and they're trying to process what the Lord has said to them. And for example, I think that the office of prophet in the Old Testament didn't operate the way the gift of prophecy works in the New Testament, because they were getting the very words of God, that they were receiving the very words of God, the words that end up in the pages of Scripture. We don't receive prophecy like that. We're God's saying something to us, and we're trying to process, what He's saying, and we might miss on part of it, but we might be spot on some of it. And we just need to be able to, at the end of the day, is we want to test all things and hold fast to that which is good, is what Paul said. Approve them. And Paul even said, we want to approve these things, after, and put it to the test. And if you're putting it to the test and it doesn't seem to be measuring up to what you thought it was, then you just go, wow, Lord, thanks for helping me discover that that's not what it was. And I'm resting in you, I'm trusting in you that you have something that's far better than I could ever ask, think, or hope for. So,
yeah. Candace, what do you think of this?
That was so helpful. Thank you guys so much. And it's definitely, I think a couple years ago I would have been knocked down so much so that I'd be like, okay, God, I didn't hear from you. I guess, I'm out. But now it's like, no, I'm going to hold on even stronger to him regardless of what I'm seeing or what I'm hearing. And I can't quote it right, but I think it's 1 Corinthians 2:9 of what no eye has seen, what no ear has heard.
Yes.
And just understanding that, it's, even if I heard it wrong or others heard it wrong, it's okay. Thank you, guys.
Yeah. You're so welcome, Candace. Hey, God is with you. He's for you. That's the great thing to hope in and the great thing to trust in. So bless you.
Bobby?
Yeah, the other thing it really is, because there are these situations, right, where you could be hearing accurately, and as Richard said, it could take a little bit of time for everything to be aligned, but the particular thing you're thinking about, it's going to require him to hear accurately.
Yep.
So sometimes it's not that you are disillusioned, it's just he isn't hearing accurately.
The guy.
His name's Richard too,
but then, okay, so the guy, X is not quite getting it. Richard is might not be hearing correctly here either. But nevertheless, this kind of stuff is always where our faith gets tested the most, and so many people get disillusioned because they pray and they think God was going to do something, and I think it just helps me to remember, if something didn't turn out the way that I thought, and I was truly being obedient, then I just have to step back and give the benefit of the doubt to the Lord, and maybe maybe my motives, I couldn't search my motives out clearly because I wanted something so badly. Or maybe I was blinded, or maybe I was looking for something too much so. Maybe I was hearing spot on, but then it was kind of like an Abraham Isaac moment where God just says, now offer it up to me. Like, I'll give you Isaac, now offer Isaac up. And then you offer that up. Right. And then, so there are lots of different types of spiritual moments. God's greatest desire for us is for us to love him and to become like him. And he'll use all kinds of circumstances. But the thing that can be dangerous is the other thing I think that we do is we talk about having a personal relationship with God, which we do have. And we get to pray to God. But I think Christians, again, they set people up for disillusionment when they walk around and go, isn't prayer just incredible? Isn't prayer amazing? I mean, we're in a personal relationship with Jesus. This is awesome. And like, I want to say prayer can be amazing, and prayer can be so beautiful, and it can be so powerful, but it can also be so frustrating and so lonely and so agonizing. And so where are you, God? And in that relationship, like, you know, if you go out with a friend for a cup of coffee, you expect your friend to show up, but a lot of times it'll feel like you're stood up by God. You'll show up to pray and seek him, and you'll feel like your prayers are hitting a wall. So why am I saying all this? I think that we always have to remember that when we talk about a personal relationship, if we expect that God's going to be like buddy with us and act like just a personal friend, God works differently with us than our human relationships. And I think a lot of people get frustrated with God because they were told God's going to be their buddy. You're just going to sit with him. You're always going to have an emotional buzz. Frankly, a lot of prayer is disillusionment, loneliness. It's banging on the floors of heaven, wondering, God, where are you? And I wish that we would speak more in that kind of language, because I think a lot less disillusionment would be happening in the church. Where are you from? In Hawaii. My daughter's moving there with her husband in February.
Oh, wow. I'm actually in Oahu, on the west side of Oahu. And if she ever needs a photographer.
Okay. Well, that's great, Candace. Well, you should, you guys should hook up because she's going to be in Oahu. He's a Navy officer, and they don't know anybody there. They're going to be looking for a church. So it would be great if she could. She doesn't know anybody there, so I'm just going to pick this time to say, hit me up on social media, on Instagram, and I'll introduce you guys to each other.
How fun!
That'd be awesome.
It's 1 Minute Apologist, my handle.
Yes. Apologist. Okay.
Wonderful.
Yeah, you know, and
thank you guys so much. I truly appreciate your guys' hearts for this program.
Yeah, well, thank you for calling us today, and welcome back to California. Enjoy your stay. Bobby, you mentioned prayer being like being stood up by a friend for coffee. It's almost like having God's phone number, and every time you call, you get voicemail, and you keep leaving voicemail, and you never get the call back, and you just wonder, what is going on? Why won't he call me back?
Well, I think when Jesus, the disciples, they said, teach us to pray. And there was something, they had observed that prayer was significant in the life of Jesus, that he would be up before any of them. He'd be off on his own, spending time with the Father. And one time they said, Lord, teach us to pray. And he said, when you pray like this. And when we think of the Lord's Prayer, he said, you pray, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. In other words, I want your name, and in the scriptures, name and character were intimate. They were one and the same thing, essentially, and especially when it comes to God. So essentially, like God, we want you to be hallowed. We want you to be elevated above anything and everything in our lives. So when we do think about prayer, when we do think about the will of God, when we do think about relationships, the overarching idea for us should be that he would be supreme, that he would be above all things, and when he is the supreme thing, we don't have anything to lose. And so when it says, those whom he did foreknow, he did also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. Those whom he foreknew, he predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. And then we see Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. And he's saying, not my will, but your will, Father. In other words, you be supreme, Father, in my life here in this moment. If there's any other way, but not my will, but your will be done. And I think even in the most deep emotional desires of our life, we really want God to be hallowed there. We want him to be the supreme. And it doesn't mean we cease feeling or that we become numb or indifferent or relationally detached and shut down. No, we still are human, and we want to be personal and intimate and involved in human relationships. But when he's the one that's supreme, then we can navigate the disappointments in those moments.
Yeah. Bobby?
Yeah, I've thought about prayer and our personalities as well. And I think as I've reflected on my Christian life, I do think there's people who are a bit more mystical and they're able to bunker down in prayer. They've got a very much of a reflective kind of a personality. They can pause. They can take an idea and kind of draw it out and not be easily distracted. And then there's kind of your high achiever personalities that they don't sit still real well. Then you have like ADD people like myself, where my brain just feels like a popcorn machine just going off with right, just all these ideas going everywhere, and that shows up in prayer. And I find that it's helpful for me to pray out loud and talk, and sometimes even walk, because it can help the ADD. So if you're out there and you're ADD, that might help you. But I also find that prayer's exhausting. There's an exertion because like you can't feel and touch and see God. And so but I have found that if you just stay in it, it's been said before, you got to pray until you've prayed. And there are moments where if you just stay put in prayer, there's often the presence of God, I feel like, doesn't show up until he's convinced we've really shown up. And a lot of times that presence comes flowing in 20, 30 minutes into the prayer. Well, that gets tiring to pursue like that all the time, right? But that's what he's like. If you seek me, you will find me. And I think a lot of times, I kind of want God to meet me after about a minute and a half in prayer with a nice spiritual touch. But I can tell when my prayer life's really kind of crusty is when my prayer is the same thing every day. It's real repetitive. There's no real breakthroughs in it. When I'm just kind of content in it. And I think that it's good for us to talk about, because the enemy doesn't want us praying. And maybe there's a reason it just feels like such resistance, and it makes us tired. But when you have those seasons when you really are pursuing, and that's where fasting can be really helpful. It can kind of just slay some of the flesh out of the way and let some, extra filling flow into our life. But it's not even realistic. I mean, I do think there's just fillings, ongoing fillings throughout our life, and then you get dry, and then you got to get filled up again. I just don't think anybody lives with a full tank all their life. I think that we always have to be aware that, where are we? If the goal is to have a full tank for God, be full of the Spirit, where are we? Are we on the side of the road out of gas? Did we run out of gas long ago? Did we give up on God altogether and we got out of the car and just start walking? Do we got a half tank? Is the warning light on? Like, hey, you got about 7 miles to empty and then you're going off a cliff. Or are we full? I think we just need to kind of go and fill up on the Lord.
Yeah, and the fact that Jesus had an observable prayer life would tell us that God the Son, in his humanity, understood the necessity of time with the Father. And I think we somehow think that, well, that's because Jesus is Jesus. And, but if the very Son of God needed to draw near to his Father as man, then you and I, we need to. And Bobby, I think when you were saying, God says, if you seek me, you'll find me. When you seek me with your whole heart. And now in our day and age, search is equivalent with the search engine, right? And we can just type in we don't even get the whole word typed out, and suggestions come up that it's going to run us to, and we just think that's how easy seeking God is. It isn't quite that. So there's a the idea of spiritual disciplines sound great, except for that word discipline. So anyway,
right?
Yes.
All right, Candace, thank you for your phone call today on Pastor's Perspective, which led to a great conversation on prayer. Remember that we archive all of our programs on Facebook, YouTube, and Spotify, the way Candace listens. And that way you can go back and listen, or if you miss an episode, you can check them out. You can subscribe to our channel on YouTube. You can click the bell icon. Whenever we do something live, you'll get notified. And we are going to take a quick break right now. We'll be back with more of your questions. Give us a call. Got an open line or two at 888-564-6173. If you are watching on Facebook, YouTube, or TikTok, we're here Monday, December 19th, 2022, live, waiting to talk to you at 888-564-6173, 888-564-6173. We're back on Pastor's Perspective. Thank you so much for listening on the radio and for watching on Facebook, YouTube, and TikTok. My name is Brian Perez, and answering your questions today, we've got Bobby Conway from North Carolina and Richard Cimino from Southern California. And we're going to go to the phones, talk to Veronica. Where's Veronica from? I don't know. Alaska. Get it? Alaska. Never mind. That was... Veronica, welcome to the program.
Hi.
Hi, sorry about that. Please forgive me.
Yeah. I was just calling because I was curious. In the book of Samuel, it says that when David built his city at Jerusalem, that he didn't allow the blind or the lame people to enter his city, and the only one that he allowed was Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. I was just wondering why.
Yeah, Bobby, how would you answer that?
Well, I certainly don't think that David would have discriminated on. It does make me wonder about that passage.
What's the address there, Bobby? You know?
2 Samuel 5, verse 8, where it is actually a little bit weird because in verse 8, it reads, it says,
I got it.
David said on that day, and David said on that day, whoever would strike the Jebusites, let him get up the water shaft to attack the lame and the blind, who are hated by David's soul. Therefore it said, the blind and the lame shall not come into the house. I've not really stopped to pause this particular verse and reflect on it. That is an interesting phrase. I mean, I don't think his soul would hate the lame and the blind, but I'd have to step back and really chew on that myself. That's a good question, and I know there's a good answer. And perhaps Richard has got something to speak into that. I just know in this passage you've got the Jebusites, they're taunting David. And in this passage, even, the most weakest, aren't going to be able to, prevent David from overcoming what he needs to. But I don't know how I would respond on that. I haven't thought on that. That's one of the nice things about this show. Sometimes one of you asks a question and you go, that's worth chewing on. I haven't really thought about that. But David or Richard, what do you got there?
Well, I have this from the Bible Knowledge Commentary. This guy, I think he really frames this really well. He said, so galling to David was the Jebusite sarcasm about the blind and the lame that it became proverbial to speak of his enemies in general as the blind and the lame. So this is more of a position of, it's not like he's prejudiced against or marginalizing the literal lame and blind, but it's like, no, there's no more enemies going to come in here into this city the way they were in that city. And historically up to that point, until God's appointed king, David, was enthroned, that they were finally able to overthrow this city. And so feeble were the attempts of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to take the city that they were saying, hey, even the lame and the blind here can ward you guys off, right? So that's the sense about the lame and the blind that they were by which they mocked David. The Jebusites mocked David, but David was so galled by it that it's like that was the term for his enemies from that point forward. So I think that's really helpful. I think it's a great insight.
Yeah, I do too. I think that does offer, you know what it is? I mean, what we're looking for too, when something like this comes up is that a plausible explanation? And I think it is because what doesn't seem, I would give the benefit of the doubt to David on this. Like, why would David hate blind people and lame people? And why wouldn't the blind and the lame be able to make their way into the royal city? That wouldn't make sense, right? But at first glance, you read that, and of course, why? If Mephibosheth, we can't just say, oh well, Mephibosheth's the only one he didn't hate because of his kind of pledge to Jonathan. So I think that's a good explanation as well. But yeah, I appreciate that question, and I appreciate your input there, Richard.
Yeah, Veronica, what do you think?
That's really interesting. So what was the reason? That it was because his enemies mocked him based on the lame and blind people that were in the city? And so
well, again, the Jebusites thought so lowly of the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and were so confident that they could never take the city that would become the city of David. They would never be able to take Jerusalem. That would become the heart of the very people of God. They were so confident of that they said, look, just try, because we'll just put our lame and blind up here and they'll defend you. They'll defend us against you. You'll never come in. And, our weakest can defeat your strongest.
Your army is so bad that we can just
put the blind guys there and they'll wipe you out. Mm-hmm. And so from that point forward, the lame and the blind became synonymous in David's understanding. The lame and the blind became the synonym for the enemies of God's people, not just the literal lame and the literal blind. So that's just the way they would think of their enemies because of that reference. So
there's a modern translation that says, "I can take you on with both hands tied behind my back." No, I'm kidding. It doesn't say that, but that's basically the same
something like that.
Yes.
Yeah, right?
Yeah. All right, Veronica, thanks for your question today.
Thank you.
All right. And how do you listen to us in Alaska?
Oh, I'm listening on my phone.
Ah, very good. You've got the K-Wave app. Yes?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you for listening in Alaska. 888-564-6173 is our number. We'd love to hear from you. Let's see where is Michael in California? What did you want to know, Michael?
Gentlemen, thank you for taking my phone call. I was calling because I've been a Christian for about 20 plus years, and the entire time I've been a believer. I've been attending Calvary chapels, and the last 4 or 5 years I've really explored and have discovered a lot of different ministries, other ministries online, and some Bible scholars like Michael S. Heiser. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with him at all, but anyways, I've come across some. The last couple of years, I've come across some information that revealed like there's textual difference, like the genealogies in Genesis 5 and in Genesis 11, the Table of Nations. Like there's a difference with the Masoretic text, which, as you guys know, most English translations, King James, New King James, etc., have been translated from the Masoretic text, and then the Septuagint. And then even if you look at some of the books that have been found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, like there's like textual differences with the Septuagint. Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls books. The Samaritan Pentateuch, which predates the Masoretic text. So, and even like verses like Deuteronomy 32, 7 and 8. There's Michael Heiser has a whole like teaching on this, which what he calls the Deuteronomy worldview, the Deuteronomy 32 worldview, which has something to do with the fact that God, after the Tower of Babel, it's kind of like a punishment towards humanity. God essentially assigned, his divine counsel, right, a lower Elohim, lower gods to kind of rule over the nations. Mm-hmm. In reality, they were supposed to.
I'm not sure if you're wanting to teach or if you have a question, because there's so much you're getting into right now. So did you want to comment? Because the amount of stuff you're bringing out right now.
Sorry, I'll keep it brief then. So the question was, do you guys think that the Masoretic text is something that, is it, you guys have the opinion that there's some discrepancies with it, and maybe that, churches at large should be utilizing, translations based on the Septuagint, or, I just want to get your guys' opinion on that, because I'm kind of, myself in particular, I'm kind of split on that.
All right. Bobby, what do you say?
Yeah, so the job that we would have to do, I think that all of us, when we're doing our studies, are at a place where we're all counting on scholarship in some area of our life, okay? So no matter what it is that you get strong on, there's always going to be areas where we have to leverage even just the expertise of others. And so nobody can, be a Greek scholar, a Hebrew scholar, a systematic, theologian scholar, a scholar on Ugaritic, Coptic, all of it, right? So what ends up happening is, for me, I feel like the world of textual criticism is fascinating to some people, and I thought it was great, and I was thankful to get into it. But that world, you could spend the rest of your life, just going over stuff and just trying to wrestle with, okay, well, is this particular manuscript better than this particular manuscript? And I'm so thankful for our textual critics like a Dan Wallace. And I think that that's beautiful and wonderful. But for our listening audience that's out there, I think that the thing that encourages me is when a Dan Wallace, a world premier, New Testament scholar, would say, what's beautiful is, there's lots of differences, but these differences aren't like, earth-shattering to the faith when you look at the manuscripts. Like what's really amazing is how much they can align. Now, when you're talking about Dead Sea Scrolls, you're talking about scrolls that are discovered in, the 40s of the last century, and they're predating the Masoretic copies by about 1,000 years, which is phenomenal. And what is amazing is that becomes the critical text, right? And then you've got, the Masoretic text that they're doing, the Textus Receptus is being translated. So that's going to obviously have the line with the New King James, the KJV, and then the critical text is going to have like ESV, NIV. But what textual critics will say is what's really amazing is how much alignment there is there.
Yes.
So for me, I don't want to... I just kind of feel like I can pick up either textual tradition, and I'm thankful for the little textual notes. Like you can get the Net Bible put out by Dallas Theological Seminary if you want all of the text critical notes, and it's free online. The Net Bible, you can get that. And if you love that kind of thing and you just want to chase down, I just don't want to spend the rest of my life. I mean, you could spend the rest of your living existence staring at manuscripts on one verse, trying to give arguments for why that. And I'm so thankful that there's people that love that kind of thing. But for me, I just would rather learn the broader Bible, and I'm going to then trust in the scholarship of the specialists. Because on this show, when we're answering questions like this, you're bringing out a very specialty type of a thing. Michael Heiser is a phenomenal Hebrew scholar. I listen to his Naked Bible podcast. I've read several of his books, but Michael Heiser has literally entrenched himself like in his world, in that very specific world, and I'm so thankful he does. We glean from that. So I guess what I'm saying is I would be more inclined to point people to a Michael Heiser when it comes to the sons of God and daughters of men, or my thoughts on Psalm 82 and the Divine Council, than I would to dive in as if I was that kind of specialist in that area. What's funny is, I wanted to go and become a specialist in something. And I was like, man, after 7 years on the PhD and studying the moral argument, and it's like, man, I'd like to think that I was able to become a specialist in this thing. I spent 7 years entrenched in it, and I feel like I'm just scratching the surface on the moral argument, and I got a PhD in it. I go, you talk about discouraging.
Michael, there's a book by Craig Blomberg titled "Can We Still Believe the Bible?" And he says this: except for aberrant translations produced by sects or cults to promote their distinctive doctrines, every Bible on the market today is sufficiently faithful in its translation so that its readers can learn all of the fundamental truths of Christianity accurately. The same events occur in all versions, the same characters appear, the same commands are given, the same wisdom is imparted, the same prophecies are articulated, the same doctrine promulgated, and so on. That just reinforces what Bobby had just said. So hope that's helpful to you.
Yeah, that book, Can We Still Believe the Bible, by Craig Blomberg. Not Bloomberg, but Blomberg. Check that out. Bobby, question for you. The Bible tells us to study to show ourselves approved unto God. So, but how, like you said right now, you spent 7 years trying to become, a specialist in one particular area, and then you kind of said, you felt like you were just scratching the surface, like you said. So how much study should we put in? Like you said, there's guys like Michael Heiser and our caller, Michael, who just want to make sure that they're getting the proper definition of all these different words and everything else. So how far should we dig in?
Yeah, maybe Michael seemed like he really enjoyed talking about the subject, so maybe this is something that he wants to go into. So I celebrate the fact that you got people that want to go that route. That's a beautiful thing. And I'm going to do what Richard just did and say, hey, here's what Craig Blomberg said, or here's what F.F. Bruce said, or here's what Darrell Bach or Daniel Wallace or Mike Licona or N.T. Wright. I'm going to want to be aware of these scholars in these particular areas and then point people, because this particular area right there, when you're dealing with the manuscripts, it is so abundant. Like there's the amount, you're talking, the number's always growing, even like with New Testament documents, about 6,000. The number, I don't even know if it quite hit that number, right? You hear 5,500 and 5,700. It's always growing. Well, can you imagine? You'd first just to even deal with those, you'd have to have mastered the Greek language, right? And then you would have to understand the context from where all 6,000 pieces or fragments or manuscripts came from, how long they've been around, the dating, all of that, whether it's an uncial or minuscule, whether capitalized or non-cap, like it is mind-boggling. So that's where I say, for me, I was like, man, I'm just going to appreciate what they've done, and thank God that there's people that are willing to tweak on that. But I felt like that we should do what Richard did, and that's be encouraged by a statement like Blomberg. And if, Michael, you're tempted to doubt or anything like that, man, I've been down that pathway, and it can wreck you. I would encourage you just to rest in the Word. And by the way, we shouldn't be surprised by this. What else would you expect with all that time when they didn't have the printing presses? There's going to be copyist errors. They didn't have that. They didn't have like the ink and the print, and they're being persecuted and they're being spread out, and their copies are being ruined, and they're writing on the best thing that they can, and they're being passed around and traveled. Thank God that we have this abundance of riches, but also that abundance of riches can paralyze us mentally because there's so much to chew through.
Yeah, and this is something that's really sticking with me, and it's in particular in light of the time in which we live, in which we have so much access to so much biblical information, sound biblical information. Granted, there's a spectrum in which we find this stuff, but we would say orthodox, and within orthodoxy, there's a little bit of breadth in it, but nonetheless, it's still orthodox, and we have so much of it, and it's so accessible, and there's such a massive consumption of it, and yet in 2020, the church falls apart, looks horrible, misrepresents the gospel. Now, Paul wrote these words in the first century. He said, he goes, let your manner of life be worthy of the gospel of Christ, so that whether I come and see you or am absent, I may hear of you that you're standing firm in one spirit, with one mind, striving side by side for the faith of the gospel. There was no Michael Heisner in those days. The New Testament hadn't even been completed. Mm-hmm. And yet their testimony, as those whose lives look like the faith, that the body of stuff that needed to be believed for faith, for salvation, he's saying, I want you together to be striving for the faith of the gospel. And they had so little, and yet those who had so little did so much. And here we are, we have so much, and we're doing so little. And I think, we don't want to get lost, in this massive mountain of how much information we have, and how we differ in the way we view all of this information. Once these people, they didn't have any of that, but they knew Jesus.
Yeah.
So,
Bobby?
It is a good point, because if you think about the early church too, and again, there's so many of these books, like Peter Williams, Can We Trust the Gospel? There's all kinds of stuff that we can look at, but I'm thankful for those resources, and we should study to show ourselves approved. Yep. But to your point, Richard, it can be pretty exhausting. I think that's one of the reasons people have so many doubts today. Think about it. In that Greco-Roman world where Christianity comes on the scenes, and the Spirit of God shows up in Acts 2, the church is born, they begin to spread out. what was the church growing on? Well, loving God, loving people, celebrating the gospel. Like, they didn't even have the first book of the New Testament, which probably, let's say, Galatians, AD 49. The church is getting its start in the early 30s. So you're talking over a decade and a half before you have the first book of the New Testament.
Yeah.
So they're thriving, they're growing. So they're showing themselves approved, right? They're cutting their teeth on the apostles' teachings. But then when Galatians shows up, guess what? Just that region in AD 49 has that book. Yep. That's not universally spread out, right? So then these next books start falling in place. And all that to say, no, you think about where our doubts can come from today and why people can be so overwhelmed. Well, I mean, we're having to answer questions that they weren't even having to deal with. They were just going around and talking about the resurrected Christ, right? That the Messiah has come. And now the task is, I mean, it can be overwhelming. Do you know the cosmological, the ontological, the teleological argument? Are you a Molinist, a Calvinist? Or is it infralapsarianism or supralapsarianism? Are you a pre-trib, post-trib, mid-trib? Are you, a pre-wrath guy? Do you hold to a framework hypothesis? What about the gospel according to Q and the quell source? I mean, it just goes on and on and on, and people just start shutting down. Right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's like, I'm so thankful for all this stuff. It's been fun studying it through the years, but you can lose your heart for what the church ultimately spread on too. And then it's like, it would be nice, right? Like, okay, well, now we're just considering Galatians. Okay, but now Galatians is translated into all these different languages. And now the manuscripts emerge and it's like, now I got to learn Coptic and Ugaritic and all these different languages to try to figure out, well, which one's the earliest, which one's the most reliable, which one's the best. You could see how people just, go, oh my goodness, there's a lot going on here.
Yeah. I just, what did we know when we first met Jesus? Right. All I know is that the guy who told me about Jesus, it was so obvious that he knew Jesus, and that Jesus was living in him, and he had life and I did not have life. I couldn't tell you anything about the Bible. Mm-hmm. I couldn't tell you anything about the Bible, but I sat down with that guy at the dark hours of like 2:30 in the morning. It's drizzling rain. We're sitting outside of a pizza place, and it's in a car going. I just need Jesus, like the Jesus that you know. How does this happen? It was this guy's life and what he had experienced in Christ. And surely now, I mean, I understand, what Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, I have a tiny grasp, at least, of what they were saying. And Paul, how he unpacks all of the virgin birth and the sinless life and the sacrificial death and the bodily resurrection of Jesus, and how he brings all of that to bear on us in his writings. And yet that guy didn't tell me any of that.
Right.
I just knew that he knew Jesus and I needed to know Jesus. And that's what was happening. That's what happened from the resurrection of Jesus forward. Mm-hmm. People bore witness with their lives to the life of Christ. And I love the fact that I can hang out with Bobby like this and learn from him. And when questions are asked and he's going, I'm going, I got to write that down and I got to find out about that.
Yeah.
But man, I just pray that the church, for all that we have, would just be loving Jesus and knowing Jesus better than ever. So
Amen. Bobby, any final thoughts?
I think maybe just kind of the theme today is, God doesn't always make sense. We can't wrap our hands around everything. And sometimes we just got to get back to the basics of loving God, loving people, celebrating the gospel. And enjoy doing the homework, but don't expect to ever conquer it.
Amen.
Yes.
That was a great episode of Pastor's Perspective. Thankfully, we archive all of our episodes on Facebook, YouTube, and Spotify. You can check it out later if you missed any part of it or just want to hear it again, take notes, etc. God bless you guys. Thank you so much for listening to Pastor's Perspective, sponsored by Calvary Chapel, Costa Mesa.